And as a result, you end up with people sort of not having the confidence to move their own body. And actually, we all know how to move. We just sometimes need to be reminded. And you're right, there's a really grey area for every movement, because everybody is going to look completely different. Like if I go down to pick up something heavy, we get down onto the ground and Andrew's doing it, we are doing essentially the same movement in the same way, and it will look completely different because of genetic makeup or injury or confidence or whatever that is. And it's so complex, and it's kind of, yeah, and you'll know with this as well, is that it's really nice to kind of allow people to realise that there is a grey area and that there isn't a strict right and wrong.
When we spend so much of our time indoors and are often more sedentary than we'd like, it could seem strange that when we decide to exercise, we go to another indoors area to move. Gill and Andrew decided that there was another way, and Wildstrong was born. Their experiences came from both sides of the movement spectrum. Andrew with a career as a PT and work in public health, who became disillusioned with the fitness industry, and Gill, who, despite knowing she should, amusingly lacked motivation to exercise, especially in spaces like gyms. Gill and Andrew have created something that encourages people of all ages and walks of life to come together in nature and move together in a natural way with the aim of enjoyment in the short term and physical capability in the long term. I always love chatting with these two lovely people and hope you enjoy and are inspired by the conversation too. Unfortunately, about 10 minutes in, we had a technical problem and had to drop Andrew off the call. So most of the conversation is with the lovely Gill. I hope you enjoy it, and let me know what you think by sending me a message on our new podcast Instagram account at Make Movement Matter Podcast. I'd love to hear from you. I started the conversation by asking Andrew about the common barriers or misconceptions about moving outdoors and how we can overcome them.
Sure. There's a couple of angles here. I guess the first one is that our role has sort of become a little bit easier, post-COVID or post-height of pandemic, because I think one of the things that when people were on lockdown and people were doing curfews and everything like that, I think it really illustrated how much actually people want to be outdoors. It's one of those things that became more legible, more visible afterwards. And we definitely saw a big increase in interest in outdoor movement after the height of the pandemic, just because people realize that they do like being outside, they do like making, eye contact with people and, touching grass and being able to run around and see the seasons change and things like that. In terms of barriers, it's sort of interesting because with the fitness industry, which we don't really consider ourselves a part of, there's always this sort of narrative of being tough or, willpower or self-flagellation, a lot of the way that boot camps are marketed. Which I think people sort of assume are naturally going to be unpleasant. The idea is that you're suffering. Whereas, what we try to focus on is that it's really fun to be outside and play together and have a sense of community and explore. So when you take away that idea of suffering, a lot of people actually really like being outside. People will naturally want to go on hikes and go on walks and things like that. And what we do is we just create more opportunities for people to do other things out in nature, kind of give them ideas or set problems or kind of design these games so that people can interact outside, which I think they really like. And I think the biggest thing when you sort of do that shift away from thinking about exercise to thinking about going outside and playing and having a nice time, you take away that sense of willpower. It doesn't have to be something that you have to force yourself to do. You sort of look forward to it because you're going to be with your friends, you're going to catch up, you're going to hear the latest gossip, you're going to have a good laugh. And there's this adage in health promotion, which is, to make the healthier choice the easier choice. So it really is about taking away all those barriers that rely on willpower and just sort of embedding it into people's day-to-day lives, which I think is sort of part of the secret for why this works.
Yes, although I think there's a few points. So a lot of our groups are based sort of semi-rurally. So a lot of the people that are coming regularly are people living kind of semi-rurally and are open to the idea of being outside. But actually, a lot of those people, they're not they wouldn't see themselves as adventurers or extreme adventurers or any in that sort of category. I think what we found is that when you decide that you're going to go to a class every week at the same time, not only do you get to kind of see the same people, but actually you end up with this relationship with a place, and seeing that place transform through the seasons is something that we don't bang people over the head with the kind of nature connection side. But it comes quite naturally. And obviously within the group, there are people that are knowledgeable and less knowledgeable about the natural world. So it's always really nice learning about plants and things. But even if you don't have that vocabulary or that framework, when you're in the same place every week, or 2-3 times a week in some cases, you see all the tiny little micro changes that you might not otherwise notice. And particularly if we'll do a lot of time on the ground in the summer. We sometimes do it a bit in the winter, but you'll end up lying under the same tree all year round, and that looks completely different depending on whether it's sort of driving rain or it's frosty or it's sunny. And like now, like all the beach leaves are coming out and it's like bright green. And there's something really magical about that. And I guess in the winter we have to use spotlights, which as a coach is really initially really frustrating, because it feels like, oh, we lost the long summer evenings and it's a bit more of a faff. But actually, when you get into it, once you get over yourself about the end of September, the middle of October, you realise that you spend all this time out under the stars, which we just don't do at all. And I think particularly as women, and what we've realised, and I think I had naively, I was brought up rurally and I lived in cities as an adult, and then I kind of moved back rurally, and I've sort of been fortunate enough, due to lots of reasons, to not feel frightened of being out on my own at night. And actually, I'm very happy to go for a dog walk or on my own. I find it really restful walking at night. But I know that a lot of other women don't. And it's very nice to have an excuse or the opportunity and the kind of safety in numbers of kind of being outside in the dark together.
And your the sort of hours of your day are expanded, because the awful thing about winter is you feel like the days are so short, and they're no different to the daylight hours are, but obviously the actual hours aren't. So you're sort of making good use of that other time, and it's still fresh air. It's always fresh air, isn't it? So you're still getting that added benefit. And as you say about sort of, being in connection to the ground and so on. Do you get people who come along who are interested, they're curious, but are not too keen on the kind of sitting on the ground or touching the ground or whatever, who haven't had that actual physical connection with nature?
Yes. And I think it can be quite, particularly if you join in the winter months, or the last winter is a good example, because it essentially rained across the UK from about October through to last week. It can take, I think when people first join, they can find it quite, they don't want to get muddy, and there's a lot around that. But actually, when you join a group that's already there, and you realise that, it's a good quote from, there's the guy who set up a group called Wellness Walks, and this is his quote, so I'm going to attribute it to Kelvin. But he had a good quote about, once you can show people that they don't melt in the rain, they'll come back. And it's true, like when they realise that, and ultimately these classes are an hour and 20 of Andrew's there and talking, but an hour ultimately. And I think when you know that, and that you can go home afterwards, and that it's not, you kind of, it sort of awakens something that you didn't realise that you had lost, or that you were aware of.
And it's also about leaning into discomfort a bit. Are people a bit more resistant to kind of touching the ground, being outside and so on, because, they're generally less used to pushing themselves into that discomfort in life in general?
Do you want me to take that? I think, yes, to a certain extent, but actually it doesn't take too long to kind of reintroduce them to the ground and to getting a little bit grubby. We're not asking people to do a sort of extreme challenge where they're wading through mud. And actually, once they've come a few times, it starts to kind of click with them. Something that we're working on now that will be ready next year is on more of a new offering that will be in parks and urban areas, and that will be interesting because the barriers to sort of getting outside, if you live in an urban area, are much more. There are more of them, and they're more complex. Yeah.
Much greater, yeah. And so, what's your suggestions for people who are in an urban environment? I know, obviously, most people will have some access to kind of a park or a play area, but parks are. Play areas particularly are, they're seen as for children, aren't they? And some even have signs on them saying kind of no under 12s, even though the equipment clearly is nice and robust and is well, I know it works for adults because, and I know you do because we've tried it, despite the signage. What would you advise people who are in a more urban area in terms of being able to use those spaces?
It's about, as with everything, and if you want to stay at something, you've got to find your people. So finding a few friends or one friend that will kind of come outside with you and be the slightly weird ones who are kind of balancing on things or climbing on things or jumping off things with your kids. It's much easier to do when you're in a group or if there are a few of you rather than you on your own. And we've talked about this a few times with our members and with some of our followers about the problem with play areas being so just for children. There is that very little part of your life where your children are very small and you're really tired and you can't do anything because you just need to drink coffee and kind of stare at them. But it is when you're out of that tunnel, and it's a very short tunnel, even though it feels very long. And then once your kids are a bit older and they don't need you around all the time, then otherwise you're just kind of standing around. And it is nice to have the opportunity to just get stuck in. And if there were more opportunities, whether the play areas are sort of less prescriptive and more about kind of multi-generational spaces that you can interact with in different ways. But I think if you're living somewhere and you have access to a green space, but you don't really know where to start and you want to just get out there, the best thing to do would be to just bring out a friend who you're going to meet once or twice a week and start crawling around and jumping around with them. And actually you'll find that people join in quite quickly when there are a few of you.
Are people a bit more resistant to kind of touching the ground, being outside and so on, because, they're generally less used to pushing themselves into that discomfort in life in general?
Do you want me to take that? I think, yes, to a certain extent, but actually it doesn't take too long to kind of reintroduce them to the ground and to getting a little bit grubby. We're not asking people to do a sort of extreme challenge where they're wading through mud. And actually, once they've come a few times, it starts to kind of click with them. Something that we're working on now that will be ready next year is on more of a new offering that will be in parks and urban areas, and that will be interesting because the barriers to sort of getting outside, if you live in an urban area, are much more. There are
much
more
greater,
of them, and they're more complex. Yeah.
And so, what's your suggestions for people who are in an urban environment? I know, obviously, most people will have some access to kind of a park or a play area, but parks are. Play areas particularly are, they're seen as for children, aren't they? And some even have signs on them saying kind of no under 12s, even though the equipment clearly is nice and robust and is well, I know it works for adults because, and I know you do because we've tried it, despite the signage. So what would you advise people who are in a more urban area in terms of being able to use those spaces?
I think it's about as with everything, and if you want to stay at something, you've got to find your people. So finding a few friends or one friend that you know will kind of come outside with you and be the slightly weird ones who are kind of balancing on things or climbing on things or jumping off things with your kids. It's much easier to do when you're in a group or if there are a few of you rather than you on your own. And we've talked about this a few times with our members and with some of our followers about the problem with play areas being so just for children. There is that very little part of your life where your children are very small and you're really tired and you can't do anything because you just need to drink coffee and kind of stare at them. Yes. But it is when you're out of that tunnel, and it's a very short tunnel, even though it feels very long. And then once your kids are a bit older and they don't need you around all the time, then you know, otherwise you're just kind of standing around. And it is nice to have the opportunity to just get stuck in. And if there were more opportunities, whether the play areas are sort of less prescriptive and more about kind of multi-generational spaces that you can interact with in different ways. But I think if you're living somewhere and you have access to a green space, but you don't really know where to start and you want to just get out there, the best thing to do would be to just bring out a friend who you know you're going to meet once or twice a week and start calling around and jumping around with them. And actually you'll find that people join in quite quickly when there are a few of you.
Okay, I'm just going to stop it there because Andrew can't follow the conversation. He's just put in the chat. Useful. Well, I didn't even realize there was a chat there, so that's good. So do you want to try? This is clearly doomed. Do you want to try and do like the joint thing that you were talking about, Andrew?
No, sorry, Andrew.
How do you feel about that, Gill? Are you all right with that?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. Andrew, are you okay with that? If there's a question that's specific to Andrew,
you can shout down the corridor.
I'll shout down the corridor and go and get him.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm so sorry. Bye. All right, let's see if that's. And are you finding it all right to follow, Gill?
I'm fine. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a little bit of delay in the video, but that often will just catch up. So, oh dear, I've got two people.
Sorry.
No, it's not your fault. I've got two people on next week, so not people that I know well. So that'll be trickier. Yeah. I'll fail more miserably then. Yeah. Okay, so we'll cut that chunk out clearly.
Okay, good.
Okay. So we've kind of naturally gone on to parks, outside spaces. So should we just talk a bit about because I've no idea how long this is now because I've got chunks here, chunks there.
Sure.
Should we talk about not moving when you're not in a group, if you see what I mean? So on your own, how you can start to use the outdoors a bit more. Yeah?
Sure.
So
yeah.
Okay. So if people don't have necessarily a group that they can move with, or they want to just start moving a bit more in the outdoors on their own in their own time, they don't want to have to sort of book in with a friend. What would you say was a nice way to get started? Perhaps when they're out on their walk, or if they want to sort of do a run walk and stop off and have a bit of other exercise time during the walk.
Yeah, I think you do a good job of this as well, Wendy. But I think when you're off on your walk, or if you're a runner as well, and you want to think about kind of different movements that you can kind of weave into your walk to make it a bit more interesting. It's nice when you start moving more and you start exposing yourself to different ways that your body moves and how you can interact with the environment differently. The way that you look at the environment that you live in, or where you work, or where you go to school, or what kids to school, completely changes, because suddenly you realise that there's something, oh, I think that's actually an opportunity for me to sort of wiggle under it, or to jump over it, or to balance along it. And it is, talked about this earlier in the week with another call we had, which was about when when you learn a new language and then you suddenly get a new word, and then everywhere you go, you can hear this new word and think, God, have people been saying this word all of the time?
I think that's called conscious bias.
Yes, yeah. And so it kind of, in that way that it opens up your world, right? And so you suddenly, with the same with movement, as you unlock these different levels of skill, and skill can be quite confusing, I think, when you first start along this path, because I think people think about skills as being like a backflip or something.
Yes.
A skill is it can be, there are many micro movements before you even get to the movement that you need before the backflip. And those are all skills which kind of open up your world and how you perceive what is an obstacle, and what and how it can be sort of how you can maneuver over it or under it or around it or whatever. So I think if you're going on a walk and you just want to get started, it's kind of thinking about, how can I get in a bit of balancing? How can I get under something down onto the ground? How can I get over it in a sort of creative way? And listening to see whether you've got a bias on one side of your body to the other, which you probably do, and trying to make sure
or a resistance to doing it entirely, or a fear, or something comes up that makes you realize there's a barrier, and you don't actually quite know what that is until you sort of try to push through it and think, oh, I didn't realize that I could do this, and I want to do this, but something's holding me back. And I think that's always an interesting one, because particularly as you age, you resist doing things because you feel, social norms sort of say, oh, that's not what we do as adults or older people or whatever. But also then you realize there's a lot more at play. It's your confidence in your own physical capability, your own physical skills, that you realize is actually lacking because you haven't tested them for so long, potentially.
Yeah. And a lot of what we talk about is about giving people the permission to play and to move playfully and creatively, because you do kind of get stuck a little bit in your adult self. Which is definitely a more boring version of your childhood self. But it's kind of, I guess for me, I wasn't on social media when I started all of this, so I didn't record myself learning how to do any of these things, which is annoying because I was so bad at crawling. It sort of led me to tears every time.
I know, and I've heard you, I've seen you write about that, but you have recorded yourself recently learning to vault.
I have, yes.
Very impressively. Absolutely not a chance that I could do that, I don't think. I'm sure I could get there if I tried. But what was lovely was to see the build-up, to see your fear stops and breaks, to know that, everyone has to build up, even those we see. And I think that's the problem with social media, is it does as a bit of a disservice, because everyone sees that lovely finished gleaming final article of the movement or the look, whatever it is. And they don't see the backstory. They don't see the build up, the time, the potentially years spent getting to the thing. We just think, these people are naturally talented and have kind of pulled it out of the bag with ease. And it's never the case. There's always so much hard work behind it. So I loved seeing you build up to that. And it was inspiring because regardless of whether it's something you're going to do yourself or not, it just showed that, with consistency, with tenacity, and as you did, you spotted different opportunities. You were going over different things. So it gave you obviously confidence, I presume, to then try a bit more until you had your sort of nemesis one that you eventually got. And then once you got it, you could clearly see that you found it much more fluent and easy. Once you were confident, you were go.
But then, even then, that's what I find so interesting about it. Is even then, when you've kind of you feel like you've got it, you're still on that entry level bit. I mean, this is so far away from like professional people. But it's
also so far from many things that a lot of people will do. So and if we think of it as professionals up here and this tiny little chunk of society, the rest of us we're in the rest. We are the rest of that spectrum. So even on that spectrum, I think you're relatively high, to be honest. So yes, exactly. Take the win.
No, but it's kind of interesting to me that once you feel like you've got it, especially with the jumping and the falling, I still, if I'm not doing it regularly, or I can still get inside my head and completely stop myself from doing it, which is really interesting to me, because I kind of thought like once I was confident in it, I'd be able to do it every time, but it's not the case. So I think maybe from where I am now to where I am in a year, maybe that will, I'll be more fluid and fluent in that movement. But that's what's been really interesting to me on all of these little skills as we've been learning them, is like, even when you've got them, you've got to be doing it. You've got to do it often to sort of switch the switch off, because the switch is still there, sort of telling you not to do it, or that you can't do it, or that you're going to smash your face off something.
Nice. And there's obviously as well, because you're doing that outdoors, it's easier to bring yourself out of yourself, because you are connecting with nature. You are taking in so much more with your eyes, with your senses, your smell, and so on. So and do you find that people in your classes enjoy that aspect of being outdoors, that it does help them to sort of take them outside of themselves, like you were saying?
I think so, because when you're doing something challenging, or if you're learning to lift something heavy or something, and it's really tricky, but then suddenly you look up and you're like, oh wow, look, there's a woodpecker.
Yeah.
It's just kind of, you can't be so focused on on your one thing or whatever when you're surrounded by kind of green and by just friendly people. A lot of our teaching is in pairs, so that you can kind of build up on these skills. And while that is lovely for the skill building part, it's also a big part of it is just having permission to chat. And so you're sort of chatting and catching up on your week with your friend, and doing something that's kind of challenging, whether it's physically challenging or mentally challenging, but then also just being surrounded by trees and, spotting what's coming up, or, that, and it really just takes you out of it.
And that sort of that community feel is something that you've really fostered in your classes, isn't it? You really encourage that. So do you get random groups of people, or are they already quite fit? What's the sort of range of people that you have coming to your classes?
It differs. So we have a few different groups across the country, and it really differs depending on who and where they are. So our first group that we started when we lived in the south of England, near you, was very much our demographic, because those are the people that we knew at the time. So they were kind of people in their 30s and 40s who predominantly just had children. And so that group has stayed fairly similar demographic, although now we've got a bit of an older intake. We've got more people in their 50s and 60s. Whereas our group up north that we've started in Scotland, we have two very distinct groups, and one is kind of our demographic, and then one is people in their 60s and 70s and who have retired. And so it really, and that most people have some history of physical activity, but haven't been to a gym, and have kind of always tried to find something that they would do regularly, but haven't managed to find something that is meaningful for them to stick at.
Yeah. And presumably once they've got fallen in love with the experience, then they never go. That's what I would imagine. And I did the first weekend of your certification course, and I'm due to do the second. And what really shone out to me was the variety of people on that certification, but also the lovely link across between people. So a lot of them had been at the classes for quite a while. Some of them taught the classes as well. And just how they were obviously very different in age. Their lives were very different, but they had this lovely, pure connection through moving in the outdoors together. And that really came across. It was a lovely, warm feeling that I got when I was there. And they're probably, the people who are who love it the most because they want to actually train in it and do your certification. But I thought they were really good sort of flag bearers. And it made me realize part of what I miss is definitely that sort of group aspect. And something that I would like to be able to do more of, whether it be walking groups or whatever in the future, because it's so key, isn't it? And I think for that ability to stick at it, if you feel like someone's waiting for you somewhere and wondering why you're not there if you don't turn up, it's that sort of accountability is a really strong pull.
Yeah, and you become part of a network of people who are, you notice if someone hasn't been for a few weeks, and that's kind of embedded within the group's culture. Yeah. So I think there is something with our most established group, one in Berkshire, that we set up first and then kind of left. The reason we started the course initially wasn't for a certification, it was just so that we could train up some of our members so that they could run informal sessions. And now, as we've stepped back from that group, they are, and it's quite nice. There's a WhatsApp group, and last week somebody just messaged saying, "Oh, do you know what? I'd love one at kind of 12 p.m. on a Monday. Does anybody else want to do it?" And you just see these little groups kind of coming off the main kind of coach-led sessions, which is really lovely. But it also means that if something happens, or if somebody's injured, not in the group setting, but in sort of life generally, or that, their family members ill or something, there will be somebody around to check in. And we just kind of often don't have that on a society level anymore. We kind of seem to be bringing up our children in sort of nuclear families, often without parents around us to help, or without a support network. And actually, all we need is more support networks.
Support. I thoroughly agree. And so you've moved, you were near Pangbourne before, and then last summer you've moved back up to Scotland. And part of that was to be near your parents, I believe. And so you've set up a new group there, another group. And I can see from the work you're doing that you are really encouraging lots of sort of intergenerational movement together. I've seen lots of lovely children with parents, and then older adults as well encouraged to come along, which is really important. Why do you think that is so beneficial?
I think it was for personal reasons, because we moved back to be next to my parents, and I live here. I've got I'm one of 5, and 4 of us live in Scotland, and one of us is in the south. But so there are 4 of us around my parents, which is very nice. But when we got home, I think my dad was due for a hip operation, for a hip replacement, because he had arthritis in his hip. And he had just become his world had become so small, because his hip was really hurting him. And you could see it kind of dictated every movement that he did. And he got to the point where he could only just get on his bike. And that really, for my dad, is the big, he's not a sort of competitive cyclist, but he's a leisure cyclist. And he couldn't get on his bike. And that felt really sad. But it's also looking at how he kind of moves around his house, especially compared to my mum. And I realise there are genetic differences at play as well. But my mum has a lifetime history of gardening and has been getting up and down from the ground for her whole life, and can still
Same
get
as
up and down
mine.
to the ground and like pick up 2 grandchildren and get out of the house without, it's not even a thing. Whereas my dad, it takes multiple points of contact to get down to the ground and back up again. And while he is active, because he walks and he's cycled for most of his adult life, he's very much active on, on that plane and not in the kind of in between strength. So that it was a big motivational factor to do older classes for older people, mainly just to get my dad involved once he's had his hip operation.
Brilliant.
Like,
yes.
how he can skip, which is just
amazing.
We give them little options for how, at the end of the session, there's an option as to how you're going to get from A to B, and you can do what you want. You can walk, you can skip, you can run, you can drag something. And my dad, for whatever reason, always chooses to skip.
Lovely. I love it.
Nice. But then the multi-generational,
lovely and playful.
And, it's very playful.
I mean, skipping's a great example, not skipping rope skipping, but skipping, because a child will just naturally go into skip mode, won't they? They will just be going along and they don't think about it. They just skip. And there's, yourself, that it's a joyful thing. There's a lovely sort of flow and feel to it. But for some reason, as adults, we never think of doing that anyway. And to think of your dad doing that after a hip operation is amazing.
Yes. It's really, I realised after the hip op, I don't really understand how complex they are, because he came out so much more mobile than when he went in. But his recovery has been really impressive. And he's mid-70s, so he's not hugely old. But it was good to kind of see, and he's back to dancing. My parents dance a lot. So that, so I was talking about the multi-generational aspect. So we wanted to work with older populations, but then the multi-generational aspect is here we have very little wraparound childcare after school. There are no formal anything. So once 3:00 is around, we are very much with children. So we had to kind of rethink how we work and how we do childcare. So having kind of after school classes that are for adults or for children is very important for us, because it means that we can also look after our children while doing other things, which is really nice.
And brings a really nice connection. I think one of the, people often will write to me, and I certainly, having led by example by my parents, I really want to be able to play with kids at their level, which is the ground, effectively. That's where, I've said before, my boys always would have a car on the ground, but their head had to be on the ground so they could really study the exact movement of the wheels going round. They had to be that low. And it was the same for every car, but they did it. All 3 of them did it at various points. And that's where their world is. They're down there. They feel good down there. And the thought of not being able to be there with them, or be really uncomfortable being there, is a huge factor in me sort of adopting the ground. Because, after I finished clearing up their Lego, when Lego sort of passed by and they moved into teen years, there's much less reason to go on the ground unless you appreciate the need to go on the ground.
And it happens quickly, right?
Very quickly.
That you realise the whole bit of your adult life with small children where you're always on the ground. And then suddenly, I feel like we've just suddenly moved into that realm. And obviously we spend a lot of time on the ground because of what we do. But I didn't know that. And it does make me think, like, wow, I'm not spending time sitting on my bedroom floor trying to pick up all the stuff.
And I think, and I wasn't mindful about the way I was doing that. I would just do it as quickly as I possibly, and I was annoyed by the fact I had to do it and so on. And then I didn't. So, and I see that as a huge contributing factor towards getting into pain, because I wasn't, I was doing the exercise, occasionally walking, and just being at chair height the rest of the time, basically.
Yeah.
And it just, it has such a big factor. I certainly wasn't ever thinking about outdoor play, apart from for children. And I was the one sat at the side, of the playground, as you say, not the coffee, but tea, just watching and catching up with mums, but also even when it wasn't, I was still sat there, even if a friend wasn't there. I regret that I wasn't playing more for my own body as much as that interaction with the kids. Go on.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say the play stuff is interesting because we do a lot of play and sort of playful movements and games in our adult classes, but it's something that for whatever reason we don't use it in our sort of marketing so much, because I think there's this real reticence to let yourself play and have that associated with movement or anything. It feels quite silly, and I can feel it in myself. Like if I'm at a conference or something and somebody says, "Oh, let's go and play a game," I can feel my eyes rolling. And so I'm guilty of that.
Even you
too, yeah. And I wonder what it is. Like, when does that start? Because when we put a game in, and we have games in most, we'll teach a movement and we'll allow people time in pairs to kind of play around with that movement and sort of see what's right for them and how their body differs to somebody else's. And then often we'll cement that learning with a game, and the games are generally quite silly. But they're just designed to sort of get you out of your head and switch off the switch. But when you get people in that space, if you haven't told them there's a game coming, they just love it. I mean, we have like 70-year-olds playing Flora's Lava, and they're so competitive and quite naughty. But it is really interesting. It's like, oh, wow, now you're all playing. But if we'd said to you up front, we're going to play this game, I think everyone would be a bit like, well, it's a bit silly. Do you know what I mean? I think, I don't know what it is. I don't know when we stop allowing ourselves to play as adults.
I think it's a whole manner of things, and it's it's messaging. It's the word is associated with children even. There's so much, and yet that brings the ability to move in a different way because you're not thinking so much about how you're moving. And I do think that a lot of exercises come down to sort of be at this angle, move that limb this little bit here and there. And I in my classes, I'm very much, I always try to encourage people to feel into it, do it your way. 80% good is brilliant. The fact you're doing it is fantastic, because I think that, we've got to encourage people to explore rather than follow, be curious and find what feels good rather than blindly following. Mindlessly following, and therefore being too much in your head and thinking about what's happening. And when I used to go to the gym, there was often a big element of that where my to-do list was going while I was doing some of the movement, and that's not good. That's not fun. That's not enjoyable.
It's definitely not fun. But I think there's a lot of fear around movement, and possibly that's the result of having this kind of top-down model of having somebody to tell you how to move, and this is right and this is wrong. And I think that's come out of the last sort of 50 odd years of sort of gym culture, and creating these environments that are really specialized and these machines that are really specialized, and this is the only way you can use it, and this is the right way to use it. And as a result, you end up with people sort of not having the confidence to move their own body. And actually, we all know how to move. We just sometimes need to be reminded. And you're right, there's a really grey area for every movement, because everybody is going to look completely different. Like if I go down to pick up something heavy and get down onto the ground and Andrew's doing it, we are doing essentially the same movement in the same way, and it will look completely different because of genetic makeup or injury or confidence or whatever that is. And it's so complex, and it's kind of, and you'll know with this as well, it's that it's really nice to kind of allow people to realize that there is a grey area and that there isn't a strict right and wrong,
and give themselves permission to try. Where it's almost like you slightly need that permission, that encouragement to explore, to be a bit curious. And I have to admit, when I did start moving more on walks and spotting something and thinking, oh, I could have a little hang on that, or I've seen someone do that on there before. I might just give that a try. I very much had to do it on my own initially, tentatively. I certainly wasn't filming myself doing it. And until I sort of realized, no, this makes me feel good. I feel good doing this. And yeah, okay, I can't do that just yet, but I can do this. So why not? And, I used to sort of laugh at myself filming going on fallen logs because a lot of them are really wide. It's not particularly challenging to balance on, but I'm still doing it and it's still mixing up my movement, and therefore it's worth doing. And then, tree climbing. Who knew that 10 years ago, if you said, oh, she might go and climb a tree, never, absolutely never. And yet, oh my goodness, I pushed through so many barriers when I started to occasionally have a try on the simplest of trees, nothing taxing, nice low branches, an awful lot of them. But I went higher than I normally would. And I had to be, feel confident in myself. It's amazing what you can do when you just push just a little bit.
Out of that inner zone into the sort of slightly, onto the edge of it. I think, tree climbing, I find I have a real fear of heights. So for me, it feels very, I find it really challenging. And
it's exposing. You're
really exposing,
Yeah, you're exposed literally. You're also exposed in terms of yourself and your capabilities and so on, which is why you try with a sort of a generously sized bush rather than a proper tree.
But I think there's something about, I don't know, I definitely feel like I stopped in my 20s. I stopped doing things that I found exposing. So when you're at school, you're constantly exposed to all these things that you're, good at or you're rubbish at, or you just when you're a child, you just learn things by doing things over and over and over and over again until you've got it. I'm just watching my 5-year-old learning how to click his fingers. He's just been lying in bed every night learning how to click his fingers. And my 7-year-old can't do it, which drives me insane. It's like, because your brother's been lying in bed every night for 4 months doing this. and now he's got it. And that's how you learn as a child, right? But as an adult, you just there's more stuff going on. You don't have the time to just go and go and go and go and go until you've got it. A lot of us don't. And then I think now what I've realized was getting into more movement and more playful movement and more risky movement. It's not even that risky. It's just a little bit more risky. But I had this whole period of time in my 20s and 30s where I didn't expose myself to things that I would be bad at. And I just was kind of good at this, that's fine. And then everything else I just sort of ignored. And now I find that thing like tree climbing, falling, I find really difficult to learn because it just made me, I was so bad at it naturally that I just kind of couldn't, it just took me a year to learn to roll on my shoulder.
You and Andrew formed Wildstrong partly because he was a bit disillusioned by the fitness industry that he said right at the beginning he doesn't even see himself as a part of. And you were kind of the other end of the spectrum where you were resistant. You knew you had to move, but you were resistant. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, that's fair.
And you've created this amazing things. You've got groups all around the country. And you have, set up another group again in Scotland. So it's clearly a model that works because people are attracted to what you offer. Tell us a bit more about how people can find a group and also the other things they can do. So I talked about the certification and now you've got an online course as well.
Yeah. So we've got 5 groups. We've got another one starting in Wales.
Brilliant.
We haven't announced yet. We haven't announced this week. We've been debating what to call it, whether it should have its Welsh name or not. So I've left that to Andy, who's starting the group. So we've got a few more groups starting. The certification course we offer at a kind of community trainer rate, which means you can come on and not do the certification and do it at half price. And I think that's what I love about, I think the favourite bit of everything that we do is watching the melting pot of people that come on the courses, because they're not all movement people. Some of them might be existing kind of movement practitioners, but like you said, there are some of our members, and then they're just people that are kind of interested generally in moving more and building their own communities, whether they want to be a coach or not. And the conversations that come out of those course weekends are just kind of just fill up my soul, which is very nice. And we've got a foundations course which is designed to be done with a friend in a green space. So it's sort of quite playful, and it has the same level of thoughtfulness of all of our classes, but they're definitely designed to be done with somebody else, because a lot of people were asking if we could do kind of online things, and it felt a little bit counter to what we do. So this is how we've kind of met in the middle, is okay, you can have something online, but you have to go outside and you have to do it with someone else.
I think that's great. I love that.
And it's really nice. A lot of people have been doing it with their mums, which I like, and just seeing all the pictures that have come out. They go to their mum's house once a week and do this kind of hour of movement, whether that's like learning how to fall or just sort of getting started with balance and that kind of thing. It's very fun.
That's brilliant. It's brilliant. And so if people are wanting to get in touch and contact you, we met on Instagram, as I seem to meet a lot of people on Instagram. But everything is Wildstrong, isn't it? You basically put in Wildstrong and you'll find
in Wildstrong and you'll find this. You'll find one of our groups anyway. Our main handle is We Are Wildstrong,
which I love as well. It's a great name.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking to me today, Gill. And please pass on my thanks to Andrew, even though we had to drop him out the call for technical reasons. Typical. But thank you so much for your time. It's been really lovely talking to you. And I hope that everyone has felt really inspired to just get outside and just have a little play, just see what is out there for them, and then maybe go a bit further and find a group or something similar.
Oh, thanks so much for having us and me. But Andrew will be very sad to miss the rest of the call.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Wendy.
I hope you've enjoyed listening, and if you have, you can help by doing 3 things. First, press the follow button to tell podcast platforms you want to listen again. Second, please give the show a 5-star rating and leave a review about why you liked it. And third, I'd love you to share it with friends and family or on your socials, for which I'm truly thankful. Finally, if this podcast is making you want to start reclaiming your own movement, join me in the Reclaim Movement membership for classes, both live and by replay, and countless videos of mini movement breaks to add into your daily life, covering practical and fun, important natural movements. Visit reclaimmovement.co.uk/membership to get started with your 7-day free trial. See you for the next episode, and thank you so much for listening.